Thank you so much, Roger, and thanks to all of you for being here as we kick off our 2025 NSIB Summit. I'm really thrilled to be here moderating this panel, which will offer some framing context for today's conversations that are anchored in the assessment that comes out in our annual NSIB report card that Roger mentioned. We started at the Reagan Institute this program on the National Security Innovation Base 3 years ago, really to advance the conversation that was already happening around preserving and extending America's military and technological edge. The report card in its third year now, our goal is to really apply this rigorous analytical approach to break down the ecosystem into its component parts and to understand where we're falling behind in specific ways and where we're still doing well and where we should be proud of American distinctiveness and leadership. We hope that's useful to policymakers and decision makers. We hope it's useful to all of you in your roles respectively in this important ecosystem. And so we'll get our discussion started today on the report card and its broader implications with a really esteemed panel. To my right is Congressman Rob Whitman, the Vice Chair of the House Armed Services Committee, Dale Swartz, a partner at McKinsey & Company, who Roger mentioned serves as a knowledge partner on this report card project, and Dale leads the McKinsey team, many of whom are in the room who support this product. Tara Murphy-Darty, the CEO of Gavini, who serves on the advisory board for the report card, and finally Congressman Jason Crow, who's the ranking member on the HASC subcommittee on intelligence and special operations. So very glad to start our conversation today. And Dale, let me start with you, given your work on the report card. And if it's all right, we'll pull up the grade slide as we dive in. Roger mentioned our important ecosystem didn't exactly get straight A's, but Dale, why don't you walk us through some of the most important grades that we see here, and especially what we're seeing now in our third year of this analysis on trends, on implications, and maybe on some key takeaways that we should have in mind.
Sure. Thanks, Rachel. Thanks for having us here. Congratulations to you and the team on getting this out and putting on an amazing event. And thank you to all of you for wanting to talk about national security innovation based grades at 8:30 in the morning. Maybe I'll answer the question just quickly through, I think, 3 broad themes that we see in some of the grades that tie to that. Piece 1, and this is building a little bit on what Roger mentioned previously, is the national security and innovation base is increasingly, as we think about defense modernization and acquisition, is running at 2 speeds right now. Speed 1 is acceleration and dynamism in the private sector. If you actually look at the 4 grades, A's are distinctive grades, B's are also really good grades. If you look at the A's and B's that you see on there on the report card, all of those are driven primarily by private sector related inputs. The great news is that America continues to lead the world in innovation, dynamism, technological leadership in many key areas. That is always in peril. We have to keep running fast. As we think about capital in the system, it is something where that grade continues to be strong. If we think about sort of the broad breadth and scope of the private sector innovator base, which is traditional primes, it is the startup and disruptor community. I live in Silicon Valley. It's many of the folks in that community who are trying to provide capabilities to the warfighter. We see increasing breadth and depth, and actually partnerships across that, which I'm sure we're going to talk about increasingly. There's always work to do, but again, that is something that we see sort of positive trend lines. That's speed 1. Speed 2 of this is actually the public sector customer side as we think about it, where as we think about actual outcomes from a defense modernization perspective, we're not where we want to be. And I know we'll spend some time going through that. We've got the right folks on the panel here who can talk about some of the things that are happening on the congressional side and in the department to push some of that forward. And as we think broadly about customer clarity, particularly in an environment right now where there's a lot of change and discussion about how we want to accelerate and program dollars and priorities, that's in flux. And so, we see, I think, sort of room for improvement there sort of across the board. I know we'll get to that. That's point 1. Point 2 is we have a new indicator this year. This is manufacturing capacity and industrial base. This is an innovation discussion, and we're talking about manufacturing. What? Increasingly, this is important to building scale around physical mass and capability. Fundamentally, most folks, when they were talking about innovation in forums like this 5 years ago, it was a bytes discussion, it was software. Increasingly, it's an atoms discussion. And actually looking back and saying and I know we'll talk about this more but from a capacity perspective, are we doing what we need to? From a supply chain perspective, can we protect what we want? And then actually, are we doing it efficiently? And then finally, is on the talent-based side, we see some room on progress, but as we think about particularly manufacturing, almost 2 million likely unfilled skilled trades in these areas by the end of the decade. If we think about 30% of the aerospace and defense workforce nearing retirement, there's a significant vulnerability here, although the grade is improving a little bit because we're actually seeing a lot more, particularly young, dynamic talent that is excited about coming into this sector and making sure that we're activating them in the way that we want.
Thanks, Dale. There's lots on the table for our discussion as we move through it. Tara, let me come to you next. You've served on the advisory board for our report card project since day one. Gavini is a company that's largely built around using data to drive solutions. What's the value of measuring things over time? And with this report card in particular, what are we looking? What's most important that we're looking at?
The value is huge, Rachel, huge. So thanks for the question. Thanks for having me here today, and I'll echo Dale's congratulations on an excellent product this year. So to just baseline the group, Gavini is a defense software company, and as Rachel mentioned, a really critical element of our software is actually a proprietary data set. And our collaboration on this actually precedes even the advisory board because I remember talking to you about your vision for this product. And part of the reason that was a fun conversation is because Gavini, too, puts out an annual scorecard. But I will admit, we take kind of a shock and awe approach to our scorecard. And it is 200 pages thick.
It's about 10 times as thick as
ours. Oh my gosh, yes. Value isn't measured in weight here, but we would win that one. And the reason that we do that is because we started that scorecard a decade ago where we were really trying to get the department and the national security community to just realize there is a tremendous amount of relevant, valuable data that could inform decision making. But we stop at, and this is why I call it the shock and awe approach, both in volume of the data, but also it's really a presentation of the data. The point was this exists. It's accessible to you as a defense community, as national security policy decision makers. And what I love about the National Security Innovation Base's scorecard, this version here that Rachel, you lead with this team, is that it takes that data analysis one step further to policy implications. And so that's what makes this very unique. And as you mentioned, it's not just a snapshot in time. Because the team has controlled for the variables that it's looking at and assessing, we're starting to see where we're making progress as a community. I think one of the major takeaways from this year is, unfortunately, a lot of that progress lives in the private sector, and we're not seeing enough progress in the public sector. You know, one of the things that I've been saying is that regardless of what you think of the politics happening right now, I personally am very excited about the fact that there seems to be a moment in time for bold, dramatic change. And, you know, I know in companies, when we need bold and dramatic change, we're not shy about giving teams a kick in the pants if they're underperforming. So I think the department needs a massive kick in the pants in this area and should be held accountable to catching up in progress to match what is happening among the investor community and among the technology sector.
Let's have our members of Congress now help us kind of zoom out, understand the broader context here, and importantly, what we should do about it all. Mr. Whitman, you've been such a leader in Congress on this set of issues, and in particular, last year, just around this time, launched the House Defense Modernization Caucus. Our report card gave a D for defense modernization.
Yes.
What's your assessment there? Have we missed something? Are we off base or on base? And I think more to the point, how do you assess our ability or the ability of this ecosystem and the U.S. government piece in particular to translate the progress that we're seeing in innovation into delivered capabilities?
Well, listen, I think the score is a deserved score, unfortunately, but I think the possibilities are there. What you heard here is what we have seen through the years, and that is a dichotomy between the innovation and creation that's occurring in the private sector and what's not getting operationalized in the Pentagon. And the question is how do we get that done? You know, the Pentagon is the Ford Motor Company of the 1950s. I mean, the way they operate, slow, stoic. Let's spend years to write a requirement. Let's spend years to go to a program of record. Let's spend years to acquire. And by the time we acquire something, guess what? The threat's way ahead of us. Great example, I use this all the time, is F-35. F-35 started 25 years ago as a blank sheet of paper. Today, as we speak, it's just getting into full-scale production. And guess what we're struggling with? The threat in the Indo-PACOM is way ahead of what we're producing today. So the question is how do we match what happens in the private sector with innovation and creation and have that operationalized in the Pentagon? It takes changes in how the Pentagon operates, and Congress has to be at the forefront of that. Last year, we made some changes to authorities to operate. We made sure things like the Strategic Capabilities Office, the Space Development Command got some additional authorities to be able to do things faster. What we want is to have the Pentagon reflect not the Ford Motor Company of the 1950s model, but we want them to reflect the Apple of 2025 model, which everybody here in the innovation and creation space does. The challenge is for a large organization like the Pentagon, that's tough to do because there's ingrained mentality that we have to take a long time to do things. And we can't get things quickly because that's just not how we operate. It's process, 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 not outcomes. So we have to get the Pentagon to be more of an outcome-based organization. We also have to get the Pentagon to change its mindset because we live in a world today where hardware is software defined. And you can take hardware off the shelf, but your magic sauce is going to be software. And the Pentagon's head explodes when you talk about software. They don't know how to acquire it. They say, hey, we want to acquire software and cost plus. And let me tell you, if you're a software company, you're not going to even put a proposal in for a cost plus contract on software because your product's dynamic. You produce a new version of your software, on a regular basis, maybe weekly, maybe monthly. And if you go in there and say, I got to write a change order and send back to somebody in the Pentagon who doesn't know software, who wouldn't know coding if it tapped them on the shoulder, and they're going to look at your change order and go, well, what is this? Well, hold on, I've got to run it through a bunch of other people. I'll get you an answer in about 3 months. And you go, well, you know what? We'll have the new version of the software out in 3 months. Instead of saying no, that realm is firm fixed price. So the whole mindset has to be able to change. So much of the impediments, Rachel, in what's happening with the defense innovation score and why we're not getting that direct flow of innovation and creation from the private sector to the public sector, to the Pentagon, and then operationalized in the hands of the warfighter, is because we have a Pentagon that's still ingrained in process. Now, Congress has to help change that. That's why just yesterday we kicked off this Congress's version of the Defense Modernization Caucus. Pat Ryan and I are chair, but we have lots of other members there. We spoke yesterday with Secretary Hegseth, who is all in. He says, you're right, Rob. We have got to really focus on not just exquisite systems, not just the big prime contractor community, but we got to enable everyone. We have to make sure that we enable attritable and expendable systems. We have to make sure we enable everyone that has an idea at the table. How do we leverage capital? There's a lot of capital out there. I've talked to private equity firms and venture capitalists that said, we want to invest, but we're only going to do so much investing until we get a demand signal. So once the demand signal's there, and listen, scaling, there's some cool things happening with scaling. Look at what Anduril has just done with a hyperscale facility that they're building in Ohio. I mean, they're bringing on a new generation of thought process about how do you scale production and how do you make sure you have adaptable, flexible scaling to where if you need to next week, you can scale up instead of going, gosh, we have this massive tooling line that we have. We're not using additive manufacturing. So if we're going to change something, we've got to go back and go through tooling and re-spin up a line. And by the time you spin up the line, guess what? The technology's past you. So I think there's some good things happening out there. How do we make those things happen at the speed of relevance? Congress has to be the enabler there.
Congressman Crow, I'd love to ask you to speak to the talent-based piece of all of this. Dale mentioned our report card assesses some improvement, but a lot of room for growth there. You launched a caucus of your own a few years ago, the Defense Workforce Innovation and Industry Caucus. As we think about these challenges toward modernization, toward production at speed and scale, what are the challenges on the workforce side, whether it's high-skill STEM talent, skilled trades, on that side of the manufacturing piece that we need to be thinking about, and how can we overcome some of those challenges?
Yeah, thanks for having me, Rachel. We're all in heated agreement here, and I suspect everybody in this room is in heated agreement. We all know what the problem is, right? We're operating off of an innovation cycle right now that used to be a decade, then it used to be 5 years, then it used to be 3 years, and now it's a year or less innovation cycle. And in fact, the laboratory for this, which is Ukraine, they're actually working off of week-long innovation cycles, right? There is a fusion of private sector and government and combat operations where the private sector in Ukraine is on the front lines, embedded in military units, and they are in real time seeing differences and making changes to systems, sending it back to the factory, and within days sometimes tweaking systems. That is the battlefield, and actually our adversaries, Russia and others, are actually doing the same. Right? So we are way behind. We know that, and I think everybody in the room knows that. So it simply comes down to the demand signals and the kick in the pants that we need, and a recognition that the Pentagon is actually a rational organization. Right? They are responding to the demand signals that Congress and others are sent. And when we fail to provide multi-year procurement contracts, when we fail to provide any incentive for reform because we keep on upping the top line, but we tell them you need to be more efficient and change the way in which you invest in systems, there's simply no demand signals being sent. So that requires a very real conversation about political will, which is actually bipartisan right now on this issue, about how we're going to send the massive demand signal shift that has to come from Congress. It's not going to change from within DOD, and that includes workforce. Right, because all of these things, all these legacy things include the way in which we manage our workforce. Everything from our lack of comprehensive immigration reform, which, as we know, if we're going to change this, we need immigration reform because all of our talent is not going to come from the United States. We know that. From the way we do security clearances, right? I actually have a bill and an effort that I've been working on that would allow you all to start the security clearance process for somebody when they're an intern for you or when they're in school. Right, so that you can actually then, when they graduate and come to work for you, they're ready to go, and they're not waiting 18 months, 24 months to do it. 2, the multi-year procurement contracts. Again, because industry, you all are rational actors. You're not going to invest in new assembly lines. You're not going to hire new folks if you can only get a 1-year contract, or as the case might be, 3 months, right, or less. So we have to give you all that longer on-ramp to do that. So those are all the things that I think from a workforce, but also just a traditional procurement perspective we needed to do. And it's political will, right? This all comes down to political will, and that's why I raise examples of big muscle movements. And I know this is controversial, but we have to have this discussion. Is there going to be any massive change to the DoD system if we continue to up the top line, right, at the same time as we're telling you all to reform? Probably not, I would argue, right? There might be other ways of doing it, but that's one way. The other is, and this is an idea that's been batted around, start cutting the services out of this and just go right to the COCOMs, right? There is a model that we used during the global war on terror where we gave SOCOM direct authority to go right to market and buy what they needed and immediately send it to the warfighter, and it worked. It was cheaper, it was more effective, it was more efficient. So maybe we start cutting the services out of it, and I'm the co-chair of the Army caucus, so I'm definitely going to frickin' hear this from the Army. But maybe we start cutting them out of it and give the COCOMs and give the field commanders more and more authority to come to you all to get what they need.
Congressman Whitman, I want you to react on this top-line question. We've seen the budget machinations starting with the new Trump administration, the Hegseth memo with reallocation towards certain priorities but away from others. How do you see this all playing out?
Well, listen, I think there are bits and pieces of what Jason points out that have to happen in reform in the Pentagon, which Secretary Hegg says, listen, I want you to identify 8% savings, and he wants to get those savings redirected. Let's make sure we modernize. Listen, he spoke yesterday, and he was spot on. He said, listen, we are still in the rut of protecting legacy systems. And listen, those things are parochial. We all understand what members of Congress have to do. But Congress and the Pentagon have to be more in line to say, okay, let's see what the transition is. We understand there are equities in these districts, but as we change and modernize, how do we make sure that we talk to folks there and said, listen, your equity is a legacy system here, but we're going to modernize, and as that legacy system gets phased out, what are we going to do to make sure that the capability on your facility is being utilized? It may be in a very, very different way, and there may be a lull in this, but then a rebuilding of this. There has to be a pathway for people to see. I think you'll get people to get on board if they look at it and go, this is not an all or nothing proposition. This is really a proposition about how do we make that transition. You know, I think too that, you know, we have to look, as Jason said, we have to look even more fundamentally than that. If you look at where we are today, there are three divergent paths that happen in the Pentagon. You have OSD that says, okay, our planning is about the national security strategy and national defense strategy. So they put that together, and guess what? By the time that comes out, it's about 3 years behind the threat. And then you look at the service branches. The service branches go, okay, our effort of planning is the POM. So they go through the POM, and if you look at the POM, it's supposed to be a future document, so that by the time the POM comes out, you look at it and go, gosh, that's about a year or so behind the threat. Jason's right. Where is the threat most immediately identified? In the unmet needs list in the COCOMs. I mean, they see on a daily basis, this is what we need, this is what I need today. I agree. How do we push more money down to the COCOMs? Now listen, people up the chain in OSD and the service branches are going to go, no, you can't do that because we have all these things in these planning documents that we have to do. What I argue is that the planning process and how we identify the threat and how we operationalize resources towards the threat is just behind the curve. So we have to operationalize money, get it quicker in the hands of the warfighter. The operational efforts of what happens in things like Radar, with SOCOM acquisition, you know, we talk about how innovative and creative that is, but the problem is that is the exception rather than the rule. That has to be the rule. That has to be the baseline. It said, this is how we're going to acquire systems. This is how we're going to do things. And it has to be closer to where the threat is seen on a daily basis. Because when the COCOMs are in theater there's nobody that knows it better than the COCOM commander. He sees it. He talks to our friends and allies there. He sees what operationalizes. You ask Admiral Aquilino, because he gets the intel every day about what Chinese ships are there in the Indo-Pacific. What are they doing? How are they operating? He sees it. You know, that's where the decision-making needs to be. So, Jason, I'm in full agreement with you. And listen, that's going to take kind of a breaking of the status quo in the current paradigm.
It takes a change in relationship with the risk.
Yeah.
And that's why I say shifting the focus someplace where the relationship to risk is different.
Yeah.
Because, you know, you all know in the private sector that you have to take risk to win big and to do big things, right? You might invest in 10 things and 3 of them work, 7 don't, but those 3 that work are worth it, right? And right now, the way in which we invest, there's no incentive to take risk. Right? Because they know that if they fail on one of those, they're going to be called before Congress, they're going to be taken out to the woodshed, right? And it's going to be a big deal. So by shifting to the COCOMs and to the command people in the field where the risk is risk of failure out in the field operationally, that offsets the analysis here. And that will, I think, get us where we need to be.
Dale, you previewed at the top of the panel the new indicator in the report card this year that looks at manufacturing capacity and industrial base. We'll have a panel that dives deeper on that topic later this morning, but unpack that for us a bit. You mentioned sort of the increasing nexus with innovation priorities and traditional industrial base constraints. And there's also sort of a us versus competitor element here with China outpacing us 2-1 on the manufacturing piece. How do we think about this, and how do we compete when we think about delivering at speed and scale on this?
Yeah, sure. So a couple elements that we look at as we built the indicator this year. Piece 1 is truly around, are we building enough, right? And for every, Congressman Whitman mentioned, new hyperscale facilities that are announced. For every piece like that, where I think there's a lot of excitement and dynamism, you have things like our shipbuilding sector, where there is real fragility and we're not moving at the pace and scale that we need. That's an aggregate question around, total kind of manufacturing capacity, but it is driven by supply chain. It is driven by workforce. It is driven by overseas vulnerabilities and otherwise, right? So as we look across a number of different sectors where we're saying we need more and we need more faster, we thought, very important to sort of highlight this year. You can get unmanned aerial systems out relatively quickly, and there's folks who are doing a lot around sort of building that up. But as we look sort of across the broad set of major defense acquisition programs, this is one that we sort of flagged as like there's I think sort of a real need. That's point one. And as you think on the shipbuilding side, for example, because this is often one that gets cited, China's dual use shipbuilding capacity is 200x times what the U.S. is able to do internally. So that's going to require very creative approaches, business models, processes, and otherwise. The second piece of this is not just are we building enough, but are we building enough quickly? And here we spend a lot of time in the report card talking exactly about what Congressman Whitman mentioned on are we leveraging additive manufacturing? Are we leveraging best of breed capabilities and talent from other high rate production areas in the private sector, for example, automotive, right, which has actually figured some of these things out. It's not a one-for-one. Obviously, there's things that are very, very different about building sort of defense systems, but are we actually applying those learnings, not just in the U.S., but also from our allies and partners who are actually, by necessity, having to do some of this stuff in a different way?
Tara, the supply chain piece here that Dale mentioned is so important. What do we need to be doing to address that risk, that fragility on the supply chain side?
There's actually, I think, a huge opportunity in the supply chain space because for a long time we've been in this position where in the department, you talk to program offices and you have conversations about military readiness, and they will readily admit the operational availability and readiness of our weapon systems and platforms are abysmally low, and they've been trending downward for years. And there's almost a sanguine kind of reaction of, oh my gosh, we're supposed to be at this percentage, but we're way down here, and that's true across entire fleets and different variants of capabilities. These things are effectively offline at a time when we're talking about prospect of great power war again. And then everyone sort of goes, oh, supply chains. So we have to get to a point where there's actual accountability for a program office if those operational availability or readiness metrics aren't met. I don't know what that looks like. You divest a force structure, your program gets canceled, you get pulled in front of Congress to testify to why. Because the reality is in the supply chain space, if you go back 10 years, this wasn't true. If you go back 5 years, this was starting to change. Today, you can see your suppliers, and you can take proactive mitigating actions to ensure availability of parts and supply. It's possible. And there are actually some, one of the phrases you always use that I love is green shoots of progress. There are green shoots of progress in this area when you look at programs starting to change this dynamic. We support Navy customers who have rooted out a year ahead of time a supplier that then a year later goes bankrupt. These are the kinds of things that allow us to not just go faster in the procurement stage and the acquisition stages preceding a capability being fielded, but once it's fielded, making sure it's available. So that is strongly what I would encourage. This is an area where if the grade isn't significantly better next year, shame on you, acquisition community.
Congressman Crow, let's zoom out maybe a bit more even and think about sort of the way that the U.S. tends to approach these issues versus our competitors. And for the audience in the room, I've got just another question or two, and then we'd love to come to you for audience questions in the last few minutes. Mr. Crow, look, China's got a civil military fusion strategy, and that top-down approach enables some real strengths in their system in terms of speed and in terms of fielding capabilities. How should we think about our own American advantages, the free and open system that we've got, and what can Congress do to kind of lean into those strengths? Often we think about opponents' weaknesses, but how should we think about kind of leaning into our own strengths there too?
Yeah. Well, and clearly one of our biggest strengths is our alliance network, and the fact that, when we fully leverage that, we can have capability and force multiplication and innovation that just nobody who is going against us can compete with, right? And export controls is a huge part of that. I mean, I used to be a paratrooper, and then I became an ITAR lawyer, and then a member of Congress. So, clearly there's something wrong with me, because I take on, the worst gigs ever. But, knowing, having spent years, diving into export control and trade sanctions issues, I know that we're shooting ourselves in the foot there too, right? Where people want to buy our stuff, we need to collaborate, and there's great examples of us doing that, right? We have, Diana, the Defense Innovation Accelerator for the North Atlantic with NATO. Those are models where we can collaboratively do joint R&D. Same thing with Israel. We have the Future Warfare Act with Israel, where we've done a lot of really deep collaboration on air defense and emerging tech and drone work and counter-drone work. But we aren't really fully leveraging that. And of course, I'm deeply concerned that not only are we not fully leveraging that, but we're actually running away from our alliances and partnerships right now and losing our credibility with our closest friends and really hurting ourselves right now. That is a discussion that we need to have. So yes, I think what we need to do is understand that to take the leap forward, that we have to open up a little bit, and we have to be willing to accept a little bit more risk, not just with the way that we contract and invest at DoD and take risks on contracts and certain programs, but also with our alliances as well. That if we are able to do co-production and co-R&D, that will benefit all of us and open up the field here in a way that Russia and China and Iran and others simply will never be able to compete with.
Mr. Whitman, on the allies point, what can we learn from the progress that we've made in that way, and what more do we need to be doing with our partners?
Well, as I see the enterprise right now, as Jason said, what you have is China that, through their system, makes big bets. They put a lot of chips on the table. They make a big bet, and when they hit it big. When they miss it big. Our system allows us to make a lot of bets, and a lot of those bets hit. The problem is we can't figure out a way to cash in our chips. So we have all this pile of chips there and the capacity in the private sector and go, hey, we got a lot of great capability, but if you look at how much of it's operationalized, we just don't do those things. The challenge too is, and Jason's an expert in this, and that is things like ITAR. What do we do that create impediments to doing more with our friends and allies? Listen, we cannot do this by ourselves. We will not by ourselves have the financial wherewithal, the strategic wherewithal to counter China just with what we have. Where we have our best advantage is with our friends and allies around the world. Now, China sees that, and China's trying to establish the same sort of relationship with Russia, with North Korea, and with Iran. I would argue it's going to be a transactional relationship there, and the trust is not going to be there, but we have to create deeper relationships, and we have to show in things like AUKUS, we can actually make these things work. An agreement like AUKUS is really good, conceptually really good. It's starting out on a good path. The challenge is boy, it is not going at the pace that we need in order for Australia to build the submarines that they need. My concern is it'll be an enterprise where they have a little bit of industrial capacity there. We end up building the submarines. They have a few companies that help supplement our industrial base, and that's where we are in the long term. So we have to change in how we think about things, and we have to be able to do really hard things at the speed of relevance with our friends, and we have to at some point say, we're going to trust you. We're going to trust you that you can protect the information. We're going to trust you that you can do those things. Because if we keep saying, oh, you can't do it like we can, you just never can provide a level of protection, then we're never going to get to that place. So we have to be more trusting. We have to, in Ronald Reagan's words, trust but verify. And if we do that, I think we can utilize a tremendous amount of capability there that right now is unrealized.
We'll go to questions from the audience next, but Dale, one final question from my chair to you. We've talked a bit already today about kind of the pathways that we're seeing toward progress on the USG side are kind of exceptions to the rule, right? They're not the norm. What needs to be done to kind of make these models the standard operating procedure?
I'll answer it in part, and then I probably defer to my friends in Congress too, who I know have lots of views on this. Look, I mean, the point on exceptions to the rule, green shoots, is exactly right. And I see some friends in the audience who have been, working this problem at DIU and other places for a long time, and just there is a lot of credit to the efforts that have happened there, but it needs to scale up kind of across the board, right? It's equal parts that, but it's also, we talked about incentives. I think incentives is a really critical piece to this on sort of both sides, but it's also, fundamentally we're saying there's actually a business model question to this in many ways, right? The contracting structure pieces we're talking about is an underlying driver of increased need to take risk in the private sector, invest ahead of the curve. It is, as we talk on the manufacturing side, I mean, Rachel, you and I had this discussion in a different forum yesterday. If you scale up on manufacturing at current course and speed, the way we do things normally, you're actually going to have a ton of excess capacity in the system. And as Ronald Reagan's a pretty free enterprise place. That sounds like something that actually could be pretty problematic and inefficient in sort of broader ways. And so, do we need to actually reimagine the way that kind of our industrial partnerships are structured? Should we be thinking about things that are more fundamentally fabless, like you actually see in other areas, like in the semiconductor industry and stuff like that? There's like a starting point, I think, for this conversation. Are we aligning right contract structures with right vehicles over what time? Folks on this panel are frankly much smarter on that than I am. But applying those learnings as something where it's not, we're tinkering on the edges. We have many different organizations who are pathfinding on this. Let's actually pick some things that we say have worked and actually scale them into the broader system.
Well, we've got a few minutes left. Let's turn to our audience for any questions for the panel. I think we've got microphones here. We've got a question in the front row. And if you could wait just for the benefit of our online audience in particular. And if everyone would just share your name and affiliation at the top of your question.
Ben Coleman with the New American Industrial Alliance. I want to tie three things together. I think, Congressman, you mentioned outcomes. Dale, you mentioned incentives. And Tara, you mentioned something about driving acquisition outcomes. In the private sector, especially defense tech stuff, you'll see high turnover in these private sector companies. 2 to 3 years, people are moving on. What can we do with the federal workforce to actually align incentives to get better acquisition outcomes and actually define those outcomes and hold people accountable?
Well, listen, I think there are things we have to do to change the paradigm with which folks in the acquisition realm work. And again, it all goes back to an old model. Write requirements, go to programs of record, do acquisition. And the challenge is that it used to be years ago where the operators, the war fighters, were in the same room as the folks that wrote the requirements and understand what was necessary. And they were in the same room as the folks that did the acquisition. So everybody kind of cross-pollinated, and they knew things in real time. Today, we stovepipe things. So the operator's in the field and says, hey, here's what I need. I need an apple. So they send that to the program requirements folks, and they read it, and they go, okay, that looks like a pear to me. And they put it together because they're not really that intimately knowledgeable of that. And then they send it on to the program acquisition folks, and they say, we want you to acquire an orange. So they acquire an orange, they give it back to the operator, and the operator goes, what the? Well, you know what? I'll get my knife out. I'll make this orange kind of operate like an apple, but it's not an apple. And that's where we are right now. So we have to find ways to consolidate this, to streamline it, to flatten it, and make sure that what the warfighter needs, and it goes right back to the COCOMs because they're much closer to the operational level. How do we flatten how that transition takes place and how acquisition takes place? Today, it's so fragmented, it's so stovepipe, it can never operate in a time or speed of relevance way that it needs to.
Ideas. One, on the program manager side, within PEOs, I don't believe that people are in positions long enough to feel ownership of the program. They come in, they're out in 18 months, often. And these programs have entire life cycles of generations. So maybe they don't need to dedicate their entire career, but multiple years, getting back to 4+, 4, 5, 6-year terms where that's good for your military career. To own that program will foster a sense of ownership that ties into much better outcomes.
I think you're spot on. I think what needs to happen is you need to use the naval reactors model, where they look at it and go, hey, this is your highlight of your career. This is the spot that you aspire to be. You have your 4 stars. You're going to be here for 6 years, and our expectation is to have continuity there. The reason that our nuclear ship program has been so successful is because Admiral Rickover had that same idea. He says, we're going to have continuity there, and we're going to make sure that the person in that position, and it should include PEOs, has a sole focus. How do I make this work? Instead of saying, how do I make sure I'm not endangering myself? How do I make sure I don't take any risk? How do I make sure I don't take away the ability to pin on that additional star? I think you're spot on.
Well, unfortunately, we are at time, but we'll have more time for audience Q&A at future panels. Let me take a final moment just to thank the team that pulled together the Reagan Institute report card, my colleague Reed Kessler here at the Reagan Institute, Dale and his team at McKinsey who are here today, and Eric Snellgrove, who's here today as well. Thank you all, and we'll be back in just a few moments for a fireside chat.